On a bright and peaceful afternoon, Sarah, the wife of a retired military captain, was enjoying a simple errand run through her local neighborhood. She had always loved the calmness of the area, quiet streets, friendly neighbors, and the familiar stores she visited regularly. As a devoted wife and mother, her days often revolved around family life. But today was different. It seemed like just another routine trip to pick up a few groceries, but little did Sarah know, this day would change everything. As Sarah drove along, humming a tune, she noticed a police car parked near the corner of a street. It wasn't unusual to see law enforcement vehicles around town, especially considering the recent increase in patrols in the area. But as she approached the intersection, the police car suddenly pulled out and followed her. Her heart skipped a beat. She had done nothing wrong, but something about the way the car stayed behind her made her uneasy. Was there a mistake? Had she unknowingly done something to catch their attention? Sarah's worry began to turn into confusion as the police car's sirens suddenly blared, signaling for her to pull over. She obeyed, slowly bringing the car to a stop on the side of the road, her hands gripping the steering wheel. She tried to calm herself, reminding herself that she hadn't broken any laws. Maybe it was a simple mistake. Perhaps they just needed to ask her a few questions. Two officers stepped out of the vehicle, both with serious expressions on their faces. Sarah didn't recognize them. She had lived in the area for years and had always been on friendly terms with the local police. One of the officers approached her window and motioned for her to roll it down. As the window lowered, she gave a polite smile, hoping to ease the tension. "Ma'am, do you know why we stopped you today?" The officer asked sternly, his eyes scanning her face. Sarah's nerves were still on edge, but she tried to stay calm. "No, officer. I haven't done anything wrong. Is everything okay?" Without responding to her question, the officer asked her to step out of the vehicle. Surprised, Sarah hesitated for a moment but complied. Something about the situation felt off, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being treated differently, but she couldn't pinpoint why. As she stepped out of the car, the second officer, who had been standing quietly behind his partner, began to speak. "We need to search your vehicle," he said in a cold tone. Sarah was taken aback. "What's going on? Why are you searching my car? I haven't done anything wrong." The officers didn't seem to answer her questions. Instead, they began their search of her car, moving swiftly and without any explanation. Sarah stood there, feeling a growing sense of anxiety. Why was she being treated this way? Was it simply a misunderstanding? Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. She was just a woman on her way to run a few errands, but it felt like she had somehow become the center of their attention. The officers, who seemed to be ignoring her questions and concerns, kept their focus on her car, acting as though they were expecting to find something, even though Sarah knew there was nothing to find. The quiet of the street only added to the tension. Sarah's confusion deepened, and she wondered if this was all just a mistake. But as the minutes passed, she began to sense that something more troubling might be at play. Her peaceful afternoon had just turned into something far darker, and she had no idea how it was going to unfold. She never imagined that her simple, everyday trip would lead to this moment. As the officers continued their search, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being judged based on something other than her actions. Was she being unfairly targeted, or was this just an unfortunate series of events? The answers were still unclear, but what Sarah didn't know was that this was just the beginning of a nightmare she couldn't have anticipated. Sarah's heart raced as the officers continued their search of her car. She couldn't understand why this was happening to her. She had always been a law-abiding citizen, respected her community, and had never encountered a problem with the local police before. This felt like something out of a bad dream. She kept glancing around, hoping someone would step forward to help, but the street was quiet. No one seemed to be watching. She was trying to stay calm, but her thoughts were running wild. Why had they pulled her over? Why were they being so aggressive? As much as she tried to reason with herself, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The officers didn't respond to her questions, instead choosing to stay focused on their search, inspecting her car as though they were expecting to find something that simply wasn't there. The minutes dragged on, and Sarah felt a sense of helplessness creeping in. She glanced at her phone, but there was no signal out here. And the last thing she wanted was to call her husband, a retired military captain, only to worry him with something that could easily be resolved. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized she didn't know what to do. She had never been in a situation like this before. She wasn't the type to cause trouble, and she certainly wasn't one to draw attention to herself. Yet here she was, standing beside her car, feeling increasingly powerless. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, one of the officers walked over to her, his expression hard and unreadable. "Ma'am, we need to take you in for further questioning," he said, his voice calm but firm. Sarah's stomach sank. "What do you mean, take me in? I haven't done anything wrong." She felt the panic rise in her chest as she took a step back, her mind racing. How could they do this? Why was she being treated like a criminal? The officer ignored her protests and reached for her arm, pulling it gently but firmly. "You're being detained for questioning, ma'am. Please don't resist." Before Sarah could react, she felt a pair of handcuffs click around her wrists. She stood frozen, unable to believe what was happening. She had never imagined herself in this situation, being wrongfully arrested, with no explanation or justification for it. She was overwhelmed with confusion and disbelief. How had this escalated so quickly? Wait, she pleaded, now struggling to keep her voice steady. "I need to call my husband. He's a retired military officer. You can't do this to me." But the officers weren't listening. They ignored her pleas and guided her toward the police car, pushing her into the back seat with little regard for her distress. She felt a mix of anger and fear rising within her, and yet she knew there was little she could do in this moment. As the car began to drag away, Sarah couldn't help but feel like she was trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape. She thought about her husband. He had always been her protector, her partner in everything. They had built a life together. And now, in this moment, she felt completely alone. He wouldn't understand why she hadn't been able to stop this from happening. He would be furious, but even more so, he would be concerned. The thought of him finding out made her stomach twist with guilt and fear. Meanwhile, the officers continued their quiet drive, seemingly unaffected by her distress. The reality of the situation hit her harder with each passing second. She was in a world that felt foreign to her now, one where the rules didn't seem to apply and her identity didn't seem to matter. As the car sped toward the station, Sarah's mind raced with thoughts of what would happen next. How would she explain this? Would anyone believe her? And most importantly, how would her husband react when he found out his wife was being treated this way? This was far from the peaceful day she had envisioned, and Sarah couldn't help but wonder how much further this nightmare would go. She felt like she was losing control of everything, and the only thing she could hold on to now was the hope that this wouldn't be the end of her story. As Sarah sat in the back of the police car, she couldn't help but feel a sense of helplessness wash over her. The streets outside passed by in a blur, but her mind was spinning, replaying every moment that had led her here. Why was she being treated like this? She hadn't done anything wrong. The officers hadn't given her any explanation, no reason for the stop, no reason for the arrest. The only thing she could think about was how quickly everything had escalated from a simple routine errand to a terrifying nightmare. She glanced out the window, hoping for some sort of sign that things would get better. But the streets outside looked just as empty and silent as when she had first pulled over. There was no one around to witness what was happening, no one to speak on her behalf. Sarah's heart began to race again, and the knot in her stomach tightened. The idea of being locked in a cold, unfamiliar room without anyone to advocate for her seemed unbearable. The police car pulled into the station, and Sarah's anxiety grew. The officers didn't say a word as they led her out of the car and into the building. She was still confused, still unsure of what was happening. She had been through so much already, and now she was being pushed through a door that felt like it led to an entirely different world. A world where the rules didn't seem to apply, and she had no voice. Inside the station, things moved quickly. The officers didn't offer her any comfort, didn't ask if she needed anything. They simply went through the motions, their actions feeling robotic and detached. Sarah was led into a small, stark room where she was told to sit and wait. There were no windows, no warmth, just the cold, sterile walls that seemed to close in on her. The fluorescent lights above buzzed, adding to the uncomfortable atmosphere. She felt as though time was standing still, and yet, every minute that passed felt like an eternity. Her thoughts began to swirl again, each one more disorienting than the last. She couldn't stop thinking about the officers' behavior, how quickly they had become hostile, how they had treated her with suspicion and disdain from the very beginning. It wasn't just the arrest that bothered her. It was the way she had been judged without reason. She had never experienced anything like this before. Growing up, she had been taught to respect authority, to trust the people who were supposed to protect her. But now, she was beginning to wonder if those ideals had any real meaning at all. As the minutes ticked by, Sarah's frustration grew. She had tried to remain calm, to handle the situation with the dignity she had always prided herself on. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that this wasn't just a mistake. It was something far more insidious. She was being treated differently, and it wasn't because of anything she had done. She had no idea why the officers were acting the way they were, but she began to suspect that it had something to do with her. Was it the color of her skin? Was it her background? She couldn't understand it, but she couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in her gut that told her something was terribly wrong. Just when she thought she couldn't take it anymore, the door to the room opened, and another officer stepped inside. He was different from the one she had encountered earlier. His demeanor was more professional, and his tone was softer. But even he didn't offer much explanation. Instead, he simply told her that she would be questioned soon. No apology, no acknowledgement of her distress. It was as though her discomfort and confusion didn't matter. She was just another person to process. Sarah felt a wave of exhaustion hit her, but she refused to let herself give in to the panic creeping at the edges of her mind. She wasn't going to let this be the end of her story. She had to believe that somehow there would be a way out of this. But for now, all she could do was wait, trapped in that small, cold room with no answers in sight. She knew one thing for certain. She couldn't stay silent about what was happening. Something had to be done. The question was, how long would it take for someone to listen? Time seemed to drag on for Sarah, trapped in that small room, alone with her thoughts and fears. The moments felt endless, as though the walls were closing in around her. She kept replaying the events that had led her here in her mind. Her peaceful afternoon, the sudden pullover, the strange and unfounded accusations. Everything seemed like a blur, but one thing was becoming clear. This was no ordinary case. There was something deeper at play, something she couldn't quite grasp, but she knew it wasn't right. As the minutes stretched into hours, Sarah tried to keep herself calm. She had always been the type to handle things on her own, never one to ask for help. But now she was beginning to feel small and powerless. She thought about her husband, Captain Daniel, a retired military officer who had served with honor. How would he react when he found out what had happened to her? He would be furious, of course, but more than that, he would be worried for her safety and well-being. Sarah knew that she could count on him to come to her rescue, but it was becoming harder to wait. Finally, the door opened again, and this time, it wasn't just another officer. It was Daniel himself, standing in the doorway, his face a mixture of anger and concern. The relief that flooded through Sarah was overwhelming, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she felt like everything would be okay. But that relief quickly turned to frustration as she saw the stern expression on her husband's face. "Sarah, what's going on?" Daniel asked, his voice low but firm. "Why are you here? Why weren't you answering your phone?" Sarah felt a lump form in her throat as she tried to explain. She told him everything: the stop, the search, the arrest. She described how the officers had ignored her questions and how they had treated her like a criminal for no reason at all. Her voice trembled as she recounted the details, and Daniel's expression hardened with each passing moment. "You know I would never do anything to get myself into trouble, Daniel. I don't understand why this is happening to me," Sarah said, her voice shaky. "They didn't even tell me why they pulled me over. They just started searching my car. And then they arrested me, like I was some kind of criminal." Daniel took a deep breath, trying to control his anger. "I know you, Sarah. I know you'd never do anything wrong. But right now, we need to stay calm. I'm going to make sure this gets sorted out. I promise you that." The look of determination in Daniel's eyes was enough to reassure Sarah, even if only slightly. She knew that he would do whatever it took to get her out of this situation, but she also understood that this wasn't going to be easy. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that something had to be done, not just for her, but for everyone who had ever faced this kind of unfair treatment. Daniel stepped closer to her, his expression softening. "I'll get you out of here, Sarah, but we need to be smart about this. I'll get the best lawyer I can find, and I'll make sure the truth comes out. Just stay strong, okay?" Sarah nodded, grateful for his words. She knew that if anyone could help her, it was Daniel. But even with his support, the reality of the situation was beginning to sink in. This wasn't just an unfortunate misunderstanding. It was a symptom of something much larger, something that needed to be addressed. She couldn't let this go, not for herself, and not for anyone else who might find themselves in the same position. As the officers began to file into the room, Daniel's eyes never left Sarah's. He held her gaze, offering silent reassurance. He wasn't going to let them get away with this, not without a fight. They would face whatever came next together. "Let's make sure this doesn't happen again," Daniel said, his voice filled with quiet resolve. And as Sarah looked at him, she knew that this was only the beginning of a much bigger battle for justice, one that would not rest until the truth was revealed. The following days felt like a whirlwind for Sarah and Daniel. After the shock of the arrest, they quickly found themselves at the center of a growing storm. The phone calls, the paperwork, the constant worry. It was all a lot to process, but they knew they had to stay focused. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her ordeal was part of something larger, something that reached beyond just her. With Daniel's determination and the support of their friends and family, they quickly hired a lawyer, a no-nonsense attorney with years of experience fighting for justice. The lawyer assured them that they would do everything in their power to expose the truth behind Sarah's arrest. But the road ahead was anything but smooth. There were hurdles to overcome, from dealing with the police department's refusal to provide clear answers to navigating the growing public attention surrounding the case. As news of Sarah's wrongful arrest spread, it didn't take long for the local media to pick up the story. Reports began to surface about the two officers involved in the incident, and their actions sparked outrage in the community. What had begun as an isolated incident quickly grew into something much larger, as more people came forward, sharing their own experiences with unfair treatment and racial profiling. Support for Sarah came from unexpected places. Local veterans organizations, knowing Daniel's service history, rallied behind them, offering emotional support and sharing their voices through social media and public forums. It wasn't just about one woman anymore. It was about everyone who had ever felt unjustly targeted or mistreated. People in the community began showing up at their door, offering encouragement and expressing their anger at the system that allowed such things to happen. The attention wasn't just local either. News outlets from across the country began to take notice of the case. The story of the retired military captain's wife, arrested without reason by officers who appeared to be acting on bias, was impossible to ignore. It hit a nerve with people from all walks of life, sparking conversations about racial profiling and systemic injustice. Sarah found herself on the receiving end of countless messages of support, some from strangers who had experienced similar injustices and others who simply couldn't believe what had happened. At the same time, the pressure on the police department began to mount. The officers involved in Sarah's arrest were placed on administrative leave, pending an internal investigation. This was the first step, but Sarah knew that it wasn't enough. She didn't want just an apology from the department. She wanted accountability. She wanted to ensure that no one else would ever have to experience what she had. As much as she wanted this nightmare to end, she understood that it couldn't stop with her. This was bigger than her personal pain. It was about creating change for the future. Behind the scenes, Daniel worked tirelessly, meeting with community leaders, speaking with local activists, and keeping in contact with their lawyer. The days were long, but he knew that every step they took was bringing them closer to the justice they deserved. But there were times when the weight of it all felt unbearable, especially when Sarah would express her doubts. She would ask him how much longer they would have to fight, how much longer before they could return to their normal lives. It was hard for Daniel to offer any clear answers, but he remained steadfast, assuring her that this was a fight worth having. They had both come to realize that the battle they were in wasn't just for their own peace of mind. It was for everyone who had ever been wronged by the system, for everyone who had ever felt like they had no voice. And as Sarah looked at her husband, she saw the fire in his eyes, the same fire that had driven him throughout his military career. He was ready to take this fight to the very end. The days turned into weeks, and although the process was slow, they were beginning to see the fruits of their labor. With the public's support and the growing pressure on the police department, the situation was beginning to shift in their favor. Sarah knew they were far from the end of the road, but she felt a renewed sense of hope. The battle was far from over, but she no longer felt so alone in it. Together with Daniel, the community, and everyone standing with her, she was ready to see this through, no matter the cost. Weeks passed, and the tension that had been building for so long finally reached a breaking point. The investigation into Sarah's arrest was underway, but answers still felt out of reach. It wasn't just about proving she was wrongfully arrested anymore. It was about revealing the truth, about holding the officers accountable for their actions. As much as Sarah and Daniel wanted to see it all end, they knew the road ahead would not be easy. They had become part of something larger, a movement that had begun to spread beyond their town. The legal process was long and slow. Their lawyer worked tirelessly, pushing for answers from the police department and fighting to get the evidence they needed to prove that Sarah's arrest was not only unjust, but also a clear example of racial profiling. Despite their efforts, it seemed that every step forward was met with resistance, as though the system itself was trying to protect those responsible. But Sarah and Daniel refused to back down. They had come too far to let the truth be buried. Then, one day, a breakthrough came. The surveillance footage that the lawyer had been chasing for weeks was finally released. Footage from a nearby convenience store that had captured part of the interaction between Sarah and the officers. As they watched the footage together, Sarah's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just her words or the officers' actions that stood out. It was the glaring disparity between how Sarah was treated and how others in similar situations were handled. The footage made it clear. Sarah had been singled out, her race seemingly the only reason she had been targeted. The realization hit Sarah hard. She had known something wasn't right, but seeing the footage brought it all into sharp focus. The officers hadn't been acting out of routine or necessity. They had been acting out of bias. It was something she had always feared, but never truly understood until now. This wasn't just about a mistake. This was about an unfair system that allowed people like her to be treated differently based on assumptions that had nothing to do with her character or actions. The release of the footage sent shockwaves through the community. What had once been a local story quickly grew into a national headline. People from all over the country began to speak out, condemning the officers' actions and calling for justice. The attention was overwhelming, but it also brought a sense of validation. Sarah wasn't crazy. She wasn't overreacting. She had been right all along. And now, the evidence was there for everyone to see. As the public outcry grew, the police department could no longer ignore the pressure mounting against them. The officers involved were finally placed under formal investigation. There was no turning back now. The question that had loomed over Sarah's head since the moment of her arrest, "Why me?" was beginning to take on a new meaning. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everything the system had failed to see, and everything it had ignored for far too long. But even with the investigation underway, the fight was far from over. Sarah knew that this was just one step in a much larger process. She couldn't shake the feeling that there were still people out there who didn't want the truth to come out, people who would do anything to protect the officers and the system that had allowed this to happen. She had seen how far they were willing to go to hide the truth before, and now she had to prepare herself for whatever came next. The journey had been long, but there was still much more to be done. Daniel stood beside her through it all, his quiet strength and determination never faltering. He had always been a protector, but now, more than ever, Sarah felt the weight of his love and support. Together, they had come this far, and together, they would see it through to the end. As the investigation continued, the public remained on edge, watching closely to see what would happen next. Sarah felt a mix of emotions: relief, hope, and an overwhelming sense of justice beginning to take root. But beneath it all, there was still the gnawing question: how far would the system go to protect the guilty? And would they finally get the justice they deserved? The truth had begun to surface, and now there was no turning back. Sarah knew one thing for certain: she would not stop fighting until the officers involved in her wrongful arrest were held accountable for their actions. And with every ounce of strength she had left, she would make sure that her voice, her story, was heard. As the investigation into the wrongful arrest of Sarah progressed, the emotional toll on her and Daniel deepened. While they had come a long way, the road to justice was still long and uncertain. The tension in the air was palpable as the officers involved in the incident faced increasing scrutiny. But with every step forward, Sarah found herself asking the same questions. Would they get justice? Would this experience change anything for the better? The weeks of legal battles had begun to take their toll. Daniel, always the pillar of strength, was feeling the weight of it all. His military training had prepared him for many things, but this was different. He wasn't just fighting for his wife's honor anymore. He was fighting against an entire system that had let down people like Sarah, people who had been treated unjustly because of their race, their gender, or simply their place in society. As a retired captain, Daniel had spent years protecting others, but now it felt as though he was caught in a battle where his voice was one of many, struggling to make a difference. For Sarah, the emotional roller coaster continued. The support from their friends, family, and the community had been a lifeline. It helped her get through the darkest moments, but as the investigation dragged on, she began to wonder if anything would truly change. Every time she saw a news report or a social media post about the case, it was a reminder of how deeply ingrained the issues were, not just in their town but across the country. The fight wasn't just about her anymore. It was about making sure the world saw that people like her weren't invisible. They mattered. Her story mattered. One morning, after another long night of reading legal documents and making phone calls, Sarah received a call that would set everything in motion. The police department had decided to settle the case. After weeks of mounting pressure, public outcry, and the undeniable evidence of misconduct, they were offering a settlement to avoid further public backlash and the risk of a trial. At first, Sarah couldn't believe it. This wasn't what she had expected, but it wasn't the end either. "I don't want just a settlement, Daniel," Sarah said, her voice shaking with emotion as she turned to him. "I don't want them to think this is just about money. This is about holding them accountable. I want them to admit what they did, and I want the world to know." Daniel looked at her, his expression softening as he took her hand. He knew how much this meant to her. They had both come so far, and now they were faced with a decision that would affect not just their lives, but the lives of others as well. "You're right," he said gently. "It's not just about the money. We have to make sure they understand the impact of what they've done." Together, they made the difficult decision to reject the settlement offer and continue the fight. The battle wasn't over yet, but the fact that they were even in this position felt like a victory. It was a sign that the system was being forced to recognize their voices, their pain, and their truth. It was a sign that the fight for justice was far from over, but that it was making a difference. As they prepared for the next phase, Sarah and Daniel were more determined than ever. The pressure of public attention remained, but they were no longer afraid of it. They had the support of their community, their lawyer, and most importantly, each other. It wasn't just about winning a case. It was about making sure that the officers who had wronged her, and others like her, would face the consequences of their actions. They wanted to create a ripple effect, one that would inspire change in the system. The legal process dragged on, but Sarah and Daniel knew that they had made the right choice. They weren't just fighting for their own justice. They were fighting for the future. They had become symbols of resilience, not just for themselves, but for all those who had suffered in silence for far too long. With every passing day, the weight of their fight seemed to lessen. It was no longer about the fear of the unknown or the frustration of feeling unheard. It was about the hope that one day they would look back on this moment and know that, no matter the outcome, they had done everything they could to bring about real change. And as Sarah sat with Daniel, knowing that they were in this together, she felt a sense of peace, knowing that their fight for justice was far from over. It was just beginning. The days that followed felt like a blur, a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. Sarah and Daniel had made it through so much already, but the final outcome of their fight for justice still hung in the air. They had rejected the settlement, and now, with all eyes on them, they were preparing to take the case to trial. This wasn't just about their personal story anymore. It had become a symbol of something much bigger, a chance to bring attention to the flaws in the system, and perhaps even change it for good. The public's support remained strong. People from all walks of life continued to reach out, offering messages of encouragement, sharing their own stories, and standing beside Sarah and Daniel in solidarity. It was overwhelming at times, but it also gave them strength. In a way, the weight of the world didn't feel so heavy when they knew they weren't carrying it alone. On the eve of the trial, Daniel sat quietly by Sarah's side, his hand resting on hers. The world outside felt like it was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. They had already been through so much, and yet they both knew that the hardest part was still ahead. The thought of standing before a judge, facing the officers who had wrongfully arrested Sarah, and presenting their case to the world was daunting. But it was also a chance to finally take control of their narrative. "I don't know what to expect tomorrow," Sarah said quietly, her voice full of both fear and resolve. "But I know we're doing the right thing." Daniel nodded, his expression calm but determined. "We are. No matter what happens, we've already made a difference. We've shown that we're not afraid to stand up for what's right." The trial was intense. The courtroom was filled with spectators, reporters, and attorneys, all eager to see how the case would unfold. Sarah and Daniel sat in the front row, their hearts pounding as the proceedings began. The officers involved in her arrest were called to testify, and Sarah listened closely, trying to understand their version of events. But as she heard their words, it became clear that they had tried to justify their actions. They claimed that they had suspected Sarah of something illegal, even though they had no real evidence to support their claims. Sarah felt her blood boil as she listened to their testimony. She knew they were lying, and it made her sick. But she also knew that the truth was on her side, and with Daniel and their lawyer standing beside her, she felt stronger than ever. The prosecution presented their evidence, surveillance footage, witness testimonies, and a clear picture of the bias that had influenced the officers' actions. As the case went on, it became more and more apparent that the officers had abused their power, making assumptions based on race and appearance instead of facts. The truth was slowly coming to light, and with each piece of evidence presented, Sarah felt a sense of vindication. After days of testimony, The jury deliberated, and Sarah found herself holding her breath. It was hard to imagine what the final decision would be, but she refused to let herself give in to doubt. She had come this far, and she wasn't about to lose hope now. When the jury finally returned, the tension in the courtroom was unbearable. The judge asked them to read the verdict aloud, and the words that followed were nothing short of a relief. "Guilty," the jury said, and the officers involved in the wrongful arrest were held accountable for their actions. The feeling that swept over Sarah was overwhelming. It wasn't just about winning the case, it was about knowing that justice had been served. She had stood up for herself, for her family, and for everyone who had been wronged in a similar way. The officers had been held accountable, and for the first time in a long while, Sarah felt like she could breathe again. In the days that followed, there was a sense of peace that settled over Sarah and Daniel. The weight of the trial was over, but the fight for justice was far from finished. The case had made headlines, and it sparked important conversations about the need for reform in law enforcement. It wasn't just a victory for Sarah. It was a victory for everyone who had been unjustly targeted and mistreated. As Sarah and Daniel looked back on everything they had been through, they realized how much they had learned. They had learned the power of standing up for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against them. They had learned the strength of their community, the importance of their voices, and the undeniable truth that change was possible. And while the journey had been long and difficult, Sarah knew that it had all been worth it. With Daniel by her side, and the support of everyone who had stood with them, they had proven that even in the face of adversity, justice could prevail. The future was uncertain, but